So to start with an update of modifications and mutations, expansions to the raw collection document. And we could even start with the question, who wants to start? I have something, but also Martin or anybody else, if you want to start, we could start from that.
I think maybe it's even easiest to start from my end, because it's not going to be crazy dense.
Sure.
Because of due to kind of family situations, we've had a fever person here. So much of my week went into trying to catch up the necessary stuff on the study side, and then making Play-Doh figures and so stuff. But I did get around to at least stepping into this, which was an interesting experience now. So yeah, maybe if it's okay, then I could just begin.
Yeah, I can do the screen, or if you want to share the screen, I can give you the rights to
yes. So I don't actually have, well, yeah, maybe just do that, then I can just because I did
you can guide me also which page to go and so
on. No, I'm not on that document.
You can see
maybe if you give me, can I screen share? No,
I can give you the rights.
Yeah.
This takes a second. I just have to make you a co-host. Yeah. You're a co-host, and then I can stop sharing. No, you're muted, by the way. Or
am I? Yeah. I should not be.
Yeah,
Is that okay now?
No, it's okay. Yeah, there's sometimes a little bit cutting off, but
yeah, I think Zoom wants to do stuff. So I'm in Obsidian now with you guys.
Oh, Obsidian.
Just push this a bit to the side. Can I hide these controls? Control Alt Shift H. Okay. So you can see this here?
Yes.
I'm going light mode today, so
that's good.
So yeah, so it's been a short exploration for me due to the, as I said, circumstantial limitations. But what I try to do is kind of to get into what we've been kind of talking about a couple of times, and even once tried. Pekko, you and I, we spoke a bit about this. It wasn't kind of some mega successful maybe at that point, and I also found it interesting to kind of step into it, to kind of try and make what for myself I call these kind of vignette, like mini organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had maybe now like a short 2 hours to do that. So it's not crazy deep, but just kind of maybe to track what I ran into. The first one was basically a moment of kind of full disorientation. So I began a little bit to not start from our registry, but to start from just like where am I, what am I even wanting to do? And I began kind of a bit thinking some kind of organizational imagery into. I just kind of randomly thought, okay, let's imagine that I want to make an organization that holds stuff together. Mm-hmm. In a kind of maybe, idea history type of thing. So I started like drawing what are things that hold things together. So there's a rubber band, and then the second is supposed to kind of represent like a rebar. So like there's a kind of steel thing inside a concrete block, which is a different relation than a rubber band has to stuff, or then you have tape that holds things together. And I think that's kind of still an interesting thing for me to kind of continue with. So kind of these very, how to say, imagination-based steps. But then I thought, okay, I do want to now engage with the registry that we made, and I didn't find how I could now, quickly do that from that set-off point.
Just a quick comment on your method, because I actually would highlight it because it's a very good method. The rubber band, steel bar, tape. The funny thing is, what you're describing is for block science. If you know the organization,
Yeah.
this is for them a very serious method of, or at least a systematic method of figuring out new solutions, is to start from real world. Wouldn't call them figure out, but like essentially like turning concrete into operations, precisely as you are doing with that, and then utilize that to create new structures. Like I talk with them a lot on this because there's some similarities with my style. So we've been exchanging notes, so to speak, on this. But like having tried such a method myself, like I really like it. I think it's a very useful way of then finding permutations that otherwise one wouldn't think about. So I wanted to comment that.
Yeah, thanks for that also. And like I also had the feeling that there was something to get, but I wanted maybe to set for this issue, like for this instance that I had the time to explore this, that limitation onto myself that I would try to kind of deal with our registries, like the elements in our registry. So yeah, but cool. And I'm going to explore this one also further. I think it is also a fun one. It was just not like clear to me like immediately how I could kind of link with the reg. Anyway, so like so then I took the registry file and I kind of mutated it a little bit, made it printed it out in a couple of parts, and then began, okay, so how do I begin with kind of shaping an organization into experience from this? And then I said, okay, so let's just say I want to make an organization for research, random, like close to my background, but that was all I said to myself. And then basically I took a couple of things that I had in my mind. So like what would I need to define in regards to this? And so it shows roles like the members in the thing, because that was an Oxel part. And I just picked randomly from the from our registry, from the cards list, sorry, from the Pioneer cards list, a couple of things until I thought, okay, so now I have stuff that I could work with. And then I moved and made a next section, which is then how do we set ourselves up in time? And then I did the same thing. And I ended up with, for the roles, infidelity, the lore/reality digger, and instancing. And I think that's such a good set, like where you can start like, and I'm like thinking, okay, so like now I could do like either and kind of assign one of those to one member role, or I could mix them, like cocktail them up, or you know, but I didn't go further on that because I wanted to kind of get a bit more like an architectural sense of this kind of creation moment that I was in. So like then, but what I got for the how do we set ourselves up in time, I got the process architecture of rabbit holes case 17, the wet noodling, one of our better described cards. We have an image for that. That's also in the online card renderer already. But I stopped with that because I thought, okay, so how can I kind of maybe well architecture this one a little bit sharper. So this is then tried number 2. I stuck with the scenario. We want to make an organization for research, as rough as that is. And I pre-made a list of 4 sections. You can see the obsidian here, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I made the roles, the cooperation. So how would that organization cooperate with other organizations? The budgeting as one thing, very fully defined even in my thought, and permanence, which is again this kind of time question. And then the rules were draw 3 cards per section and fill it in sequentially. So start from the first section, draw the first card, put those in, so that 0 flexibility. And I ended up for the roles with a finite, or maybe I can give you a better view on this. Can you see this?
Yes.
So finiteness, semantic space-time, and dotting were for the roles. Then for cooperation, event, the double card, which is a bit of a meta thing, it may be not super applied for this thing, and then the corridor / trampoline. For the budgeting, I had ovary, which is also one of our, like Linda and Pablo, I think, went deep on that one.
Yes.
And then we had schismogenesis. So we're in the budgeting thing, which I think schismogenesis is mega interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And the scene, which is also like a deep one on that end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you go to the permanence section and you get the card of worms, proximity, and setting as in a parameter.
Mm.
So you wanted to say something?
No. Just continue. Really cool stuff, by the way. Just
yeah, I also think it's fantastic. And I think
pretty awesome.
Yeah.
He's like yeah.
And I mean, like, so like I'm still lacking definition of what now to do from this step onward, but I mean, it's meaty, I feel very meaty.
Yeah.
The approach for sure. Like it's definitely I love it.
Yeah, and it's the funny thing is you're actually not that far what one could call it, like approach style that I was thinking as well. Mainly I mean this what we could call the playing the organization to existence style, which is precisely that you which for me is actually very healthy because it kind of resembles, well, how do you make a drawing? I mean, you can have a plan for it, but ultimately the drawing is you draw a line on a paper, and it won't be the picture you want. But often you're figuring out while you're drawing, well, I need to move this line, and this sucks, and so on. So this is actually organization style, which is very much like that. And there's a very similar operative thematic, which I think is certainly underused in our style of organization, and would potentially be very fertile in terms of what it can create. So that's a kind of style I was tracing, of course, slightly differently, but you're tracing a kind of very much similar style of approach, which is cool.
It gave itself very beautifully to this also.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just like you go into full, you feel like, it's way possible. I mean, there's a deep end to this one.
Yes, yeah.
I really like I really like this kind of like grid, like combinatory way of approaching the thing. I've been experimenting with like operation tables for cards. So like if you have an operation, combining it, and like it seems like on that, I like the grid thing you're doing.
What's an operation table?
It's like when you're doing you've got a group of elements and you just like multiply them, like a multiplication table, but for elements in a group. Right. And so you can have like operation tables for like symmetry or for like anything, for functions like that. Right. It's like a multiplication table, but the operation is composition, so combination, and then the elements can be anything. So, well, not like all the way, like if you're trying to do math or something, but yeah, right. Like as an idea, I think we're thinking in a similar way there, I guess.
So one thing that I didn't get into, but which I kind of made a note already for the past 2 sessions or so, that I think could be a fun kind of add-on, so to speak. I guess add-on would not be the wrong concept to describe this with even, is this kind of patch baying, you know, like a patch bay that you have. I'm taking it from music, but there's others. And I think the closest, I mean, I'm taking it from music in this kind of synthesizer, like, you know, what's her name? Sayani, the lady, crazy musician. Anyway, and I think that could, like in a kind of node programming type of way, you know, inputs, outputs. And I think that could also be something that could kind of follow here, where you use one card, plug it as a, you know, modifier
Filter.
into, yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Yeah, kind of a, so those moves, but yeah, to be further explored. Okay, so to go to try number 3, because what I thought is like, if this were to be thought in a kind of real world setting, you do, I mean, it's great to kind of be cast into this strange cosmos that you just kind of laid out for yourself, that you now, quote unquote, need to deal with, that you didn't have to deal with before, that you certainly weren't looking at, and to kind of try and mold your an organization out of that. If that were in a real world setting, though, there are certainly some constraints. There are some kind of, you know, there are certain ambitions, there are certain things that are already imagined and so forth. So like, I was thinking for my step number 3, how could one combine this? Hi, Shmude. Hi, Shmude. Yeah, I have a little neighbor here. How could one combine this element of chance discovery and kind of being thrown off of the path with an element of volition? Like, so, you know, how could they be twisted? And so basically what I now did is then just to say, okay, so you, the same scenario still, the list of the pre-made section also stays the same. And the rules are then you draw 8 cards, could have been any other number also. And then you distribute freely 2 per section. So you're free in how you put those. And I think here would be a moment where then one could say, okay, I want to play the Patch Bay add-on and not only play them kind of next to one another, but I want to, you know, define this to be a modifier of the other, etc. So that could, I guess, be a nice step. And then I allowed myself to kind of add rules as I was going. I threw away some cards that I had used before because I wanted to have a different imaginary, like different images in my head now. And then I also made a kind of a meta move of some deck hygiene because there were some cards in that didn't really give themselves to this thing. And then after the step 1, I chose to think that what I had described as roles should more be about, at this stage, about the kind of, so to speak, comprehensive role of the organization rather than of its members at this point, because then you're still at a rather kind of, kind of outer membrane type of shaping here. So, and then I was going to the step of now, also first maybe I showed the examples of this. Why can I open this document? I did it earlier, did I not?
Yeah, you did. Like, what was if you click
presented here, right? Like that is the image, right? That that is showing up.
Yeah. It's, oh no, what did I do?
Yeah, go back. Like, what was the?
Yeah.
I
can't.
Thing.
If you click on the
I just
image,
killed it. I just killed the. I just
go back.
the
Go Control Z. Like, then you get.
Yeah, the image is there, but I wanted to show it in full screen, and earlier it let me do that. Hang on, I will just get my sidebar here. That's
you'll have it in your files.
Yeah. That's
so here you go. Yeah, so like for the roles I got, so now this is me distributing the cards. I drew them in a different order, and then I gave myself the freedom of putting them into the role of the organization. The way it cooperates is the second column. The budgeting is the third column. And the fourth one is its permanence in time. So in the role, we have the settinger, which is, I think, Pekko's origination. I guess that was, it could have been either the one who tweaks the parameters or the one who creates the greater setting. I don't know in which one this is.
Yeah, it could be, it can be both of those. And it can also be a person, i.e. a role, that somebody takes that perspective in a way. But it can also be a system. Like the key thing is like, if you have a system underneath that you have these various cards, but then you put a system that everybody places a card in the same grid, and that becomes a sort of a landscape playscape, then that system is the setting error, because it's kind of creating the setting like organization, the network organization around it. So it can be both.
Right. So, okay, so this is interesting. So because now if you kind of take just those two, the second one was the filter layer, which I mean, I placed that there as for the role of the organization. If you now think, and this is what I was kind of getting now toward, what an organization would be doing that conceives of itself as being, as its role being to be a settinger and a filter layer, I think you get at a fantastic kind of idea of self-understanding. What you know, and rather simply, no, and so and then like in terms of this was also then of course intentionally played in terms of cooperation. The two cards that I placed were infidelity and saved states, and I think infidelity is one of my favorite terms. Because I think it's a very kind of loving term. It's usually, I guess, it sounds like like a betrayal, like this. That's kind of, I guess, where the word is mostly used. But I think if I stand in relation to anyone or anything, the best service that I can do for that any person is to not lock in with them. But to kind of betray them in a loving way. You see, to be unfaithful to their thought and to not kind of repeat their thought.
And a nerdy, nerdy philosophical point. This is also a very nice parallel concept to Derridean violence of concepts. Which is kind of describing the same thing, but in terms of violence, that the new creation is always violent. But it's nice that you cast it in infidelity, because it casts it in a different light. It actually kind of contains similar operative possibilities, but puts it in a different track of thought and approach side.
Yeah, and then saved states is, I think, also an interesting one in terms of cooperation. But that is because I'm reading it, some discussions that we've had in this group about saved states, which had a lot to do with kind of lossiness also, and like the minimal info that you need to create a saved state. But I think that's like casting that light at the relationship that is a cooperation can open very interesting ideas, like in terms of kind of how thick does that have to be? What does it have to consist in? And so and so
for Leo, like a short description of the save state, because it's an earlier XORG. But maybe the simplest way to think about it: once you allow for the operation of saving to be interpretational, and you allow the restoration operation of the saving to be interpretational, there's a whole door that opens from there. You can, like this sort of traditional saving being like a one-to-one document and one-to-one restoration. Expand that by interpretation, and you have a very interesting ground.
This is reminding me of there's a link, the guy writing about finite automata in user interfaces. But like the nested state machine, that it's nested, and then when it does something, it sends a message back up, and then the thing above can then save the state in the level below. So it's like not all finite state machines actually save their own state, and in order to do that, you go up, and then you go back down. But when you go back down, it could be anything, right? And like you've got the active interpretation as to the message, and then what was saved, you know? So like that's what I'm imagining here.
Yeah. And really also this sort of human realm of like, I think Mikael had this example of if we play a chess game even, and then it's in a certain kind of state, and we save only, say, position of one piece, and then that the situation is in the atmosphere of hopelessness for the white, and that's the save. So, and then when you restore it, you put that one piece and then you recreate the situation, which is probably different, but you recreate with the guideline of hopelessness. That's of course a minimal example, but it's pointing out how that kind of saving becomes saving and restoring becomes a creative act in itself.
Mm-hmm. Also that you don't have to save in the same location.
Yeah.
Right. Like maybe it's like it goes out and then it goes totally somewhere else, you know?
Yeah, the saving medium in itself becomes creative.
Funny, so it reminds me, we can speak about that later, but there's a real world case where I'm actually now thinking that I should use that in because Pekko, just as a kind of context, because you know it, we are now taking on the creation of the documentation of that inter-residency conference that we had, not even last year, but the year before, in 2021, in Pymeo. And so there's a funny thing with saved states, like what was recorded in the different forms that we recorded things with, and what do they mean? And now it's a year, more than a year later. It's very interesting. Okay, but so to go to the budgeting part, the third column here, I threw there the character and the gap. So the gap can be read, I think, a bit funnily, like punny, the budgeting gap. But I think more interesting is like, because the gap is a mobilizing. We've been thinking the gap as a kind of foundational, what do you call it? Eigenschaft, property, I guess, of the cards. Like the cards are only cards because they have they produce gaps.
Yes.
So like this kind of playing with that as basically the foreground, or like, you know, using that as the element that you actually move with is something interesting, I think, also maybe in a budgetarian approach. And then I think like looking at budget through character is also interesting. Like, and I don't know, even I don't want to answer the question because I think one would have to deal with a bit more to not fall back in kind of heritage expression, but I think it can be fun. And
I really like this is really cool. This is awesome.
And then just to kind of end on the permanence part, so there's density and there's the lore/reality amender, with the emphasis on amender, because I think the first part of that title is indeed to be replaced, so it's an amender. And I think there you go also in really interesting kind of what might be the relationship that the organization has with itself through time, possibly varying density. It amends what itself, something occurring externally to it. What is amending in a sense of permanent existence or impermanent existence. So yeah, just kind of, so this is almost where this would end. What I was now, as I said, going to was like here the step 2, to think of how the organization's functions, as they have now been suggested by the filling, by these cards chosen, could be kind of diagrammed, and then using maybe oxels. That was a kind of idea, so that you get kind of to the kind of, you know, nitty-gritty structural parts, and say, okay, how would this kind of be working if we were to describe it through writes, rolls, turns, moves, slots, whatever. Haven't gone there yet, but I think this is where this has tossed me to.
And I might have also something to, I'll be short, I'll give it to you, Leo. I might have something on that direction also, let's call it the pragmatics of using voxels. Like very roughly, like having been playing around with also this week, a little bit is like once you get to the sort of infinitely up and down recursive spaces, really the kind of one of the key forms of regularity is the sort of templating and patterning. So you're not setting beforehand that these are the set structures. This was also part of me and Leo's conversation outside of this. But rather it's more template oriented, that you create this sort of patterns that, okay, this is how you create this style of a thing, which you don't have to orderly follow, but it gives you organization of things. And it's precisely at this point where the voxel becomes an interesting general operator, that it creates this, roughly speaking, templating, which then floats there, and you can organize things by utilizing templates, which then create instances of themselves. And like that structuring is persistently important in this kind of space, and therefore it's in that space. That was maybe a bit abstract, but I swear there is a practical point.
Yeah.
So basically, if I get you well, then what you're kind of saying is that there exist elements in our, so to speak, toolbox and beyond, of course, that permit the rendering of certain structuring suggestions, pathways, but quote unquote, at all times treat them with an infidel mindset.
Structuring options, which because everything is like, from every possibility you can go to every other possibility, so the structuring becomes rather important. But then the structuring presents itself not as grounded or glued, but floating, and not as top down, but rather relational. And like I could use this voxel, and now I can create this form, and I can see these other voxels. I kind of become part of the family, so to speak, and I can inherit qualities. And that's suddenly organizing the space around where you started the organization, around the voxel. But you can pick another, and so it goes. It's very pragmatical in terms of organizing the space out of this, like any dimensional possibility space.
I think this is, sorry if I sit on this for a second, and also Leo, I guess you wanted to say something. I just want to round off with, like, I think this is such an interesting rendering of this issue. And I, like, from my background, from the first thing that I ever did in my life, like being a graphic designer, I think there's a fantastic resonance with the idea of a grid in the layout, because like, without a grid, oftentimes it can be very hard to start. You start without a grid maybe, and then you begin making a grid in order to kind of almost like draw yourself a platform from which off you can take the next step. So you don't need the grid to begin, but you do need the grid at a certain point, or like and by grid, I don't mean no lines, but like logics, like rules. Like, okay, I will always let this element fall where it wants to be. It's also a rule. And then once you have that, you don't need to obey it. But before you don't have that, I mean, before you have that, you can be in a crazy space that is really unnavigable. And I think this is maybe what you're describing in a kind of more temporal sense. Like, get a structure up and see the lines by which it functions, but that's the lines to either use or break.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah, and
I would love to share something along those lines, actually.
Go ahead. Are you meaning sharing the screen or sharing comment?
Okay, then
Maybe Martin, if you have some finishing thoughts, we can do it here and then move to Leo. The one thing I wanted to comment on, there's a couple of, I think, important things, like when you had this permanence and how you started describing the permanence, which I would also kind of put the word persistence in there. But then even more importantly, maybe this is what you were describing is essentially describing how any history is ultimately a logic. Like, you know, like we can take even the basics of blockchain. It's really when it calls its history or the ledger structure having a history, it's kind of saying something very superficially. But if you go level down, what you just have is a logic. Is like, oh, we have this logic that essentially stores to the ledger per these and these moves, and it's the logic that is the history. That's the primus motor of the history itself. So the history is a logic, but that also opens up that every time you create persistence, that is like iteration of existence, which is basics of history, it's always based on some kind of logic. And that you create what is the earlier instance or its existence. But this makes the history creative, because then it matters what kind of logic you put on it. And precisely then comes to these areas like, okay, if the kind of persistence, I use my word, for this organization is density, then its logic is taking into account how it's addressing the question of density, for example, and so on and so forth, which is very, very important. But it also fits with this Oxel logic just described. It's just one dimension more in this, maybe an important dimension, but nevertheless just a dimension. And the second point, I think what you're doing, for me, is, like I said earlier, a healthy approach, but I would even say like really following this kind of pathways, I think often the main thing that is missing really is almost like confidence. Like the pathway is actually very good. I'm not saying you're missing confidence. I'm just saying culture is often missing the confidence, that the confidence that this is organization or this leads to organization. Because if we make a counter example of, say, a normal board, like board meeting, and let's say you imagine a culture that doesn't have the conception of such. Well, how could you end up into such? It is ultimately a question of very simple organization, like first setting rules, just like you did. Setting roles, just like you did. Like, oh, I guess we have a role of participant, and then we have another role which is like whatever the chair, and then you create orders, just like your grid. It's like, oh, this role has the right to make a proposal. We make an order where proposal comes, and underneath comes the discourse and the decision of the proposal. Then we move to another proposal. Same thing applies. It's this ordering, and once you start doing that with confidence, those pieces ultimately turn into a structure that is organization. Whether it's good or not is another question, but you're moving in this paint strokes.
That's the thing.
Yeah,
that's the thing. And I think this is also, it was also interesting now maybe to speak about it, because like I did feel very much the how I gauged my own kind of how it tuned my own relationship to the stuff that we had already thought about and the spaces that I kind of was imagining in the head. And so I felt that even though it was just a very short exercise of an hour and a half or 2 hours, this did very good for me to kind of get a bit of kind of, you know, hear the sound of my feet in that space. And you see, just by the way, I wanted to take on that point that you bring, as we've kind of, as I've mentioned before, and I think at some point I would be delighted to maybe share this with this group, because it is getting a little bit more of a the skin on its bones. I'm working on a thesis right now, like in a universitarian context, that has many things to do with what is happening, has been happening here with this group, and I think it would be great to show it. What it is that I'm kind of what I stepped into in the context of this. I've been looking at a couple of a bit of literature right now, and there's a rather interesting paper. I thought I have only kind of stepped into the abstract for the time being, but I think it's interesting now about what's the title quickly? Am I still sharing screen? Am I
yes.
still doing that? I would just kind of maybe not do that. What am I doing here? This is what I want to do, and I want
You
to
need
stop
to
this.
summon the Zoom bar and then
Oh yeah,
stop
that's
sharing.
that and this, and now I'm out, right? Okay, just see that I get this up. So the paper is back to Obsidian. This is my reference thingy, and it's called.
Can you tell what the paper is about while you're searching?
Yeah, I'm just trying to not butcher it. Here I have it, I think. It's by a woman called Carly. I can find her first name. I have it here, like I have also the PDF. From the top, it says that so it's called An Approach for Relating Social Structure to Cognitive Structure. It's from the Journal of Mathematical Sociology. It's also new to read that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very
yeah.
Yeah, and I would just read, I think this is the kind of beginning of the abstract. It is proposed, she says, that the decision-making process is intrinsically, oh no, this paper proposes, it is proposed in this paper, that the decision-making process is intrinsically formulative in nature. That is, for the individual, the crux of the process is in the development of a frame, of a knowledge base that can be used to make the decision, rather than the evaluation of the alternatives per se. A two-stage model of decision-making is forwarded in this paper. In the first stage, the individual develops his or her frame. This, she says, is the critical formulative stage and dependent on the socio-cultural environment. In the second stage only, the individual makes a decision by evaluating this frame. This stage is mechanical, evaluative, and determined by the frame formulated during the first stage. So I think this is a great, like, highlighting of like or like description of a decision process, which is very akin, I guess, like to what you were just saying. You need to,
yes, very much.
The whole kind of pudding begins with formulation, not with kind of facts. You set the organization up by inventive practice, basically.
Yeah, and also when you, like in accordance with this, like when you delve down to the various formulations of frame theory, like they all, some of them don't say this, but they all ultimately end up defining the framing as a creative act, like an unavoidably creative act. And this kind of actually, she's tracking that nicely. Like with her two division, she is like quite nicely analytically pointing the kind of unavoidably of it being a creative act expression of the framing by having the first category there, and how she puts it. So yeah, it seems like a really fitting paper.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And so, like, because you asked for some finishing comments, I will grant myself the opportunity to say this. Now I forgot what I was going to say. But maybe, yeah, I don't know. No, I had something. Now I don't have something. I forgot it in the second. But it's good to do this. I think this would be great to do more. Like,
Yes.
Yeah,
I agree, and I think it's kind of like, I can't remember in the words I put it last time, but it was kind of tracing this, like how really this initiative that we started last time is really about the approach. It's not even about the forms particularly, but it's really about this sort of approach, and you actually kind of trace. I mean, people might have different opinions, but for me, like what you have done harmonizes very well with how I thought about the approach. It's precisely this sort of that actually to get to the pens and brushes and the brush strokes of organization. It's really this starting of organizing, ordering it, and the confidence part is like when you have that grid, whatever, and you don't yet know what it does. The only way to get forward towards that, from that to organization, is to have a confidence that this will build somewhere. But this is not unlike of a drawer having a couple of lines and then they tell I'm drawing a landscape. If somebody doesn't know anything about the practice of making a landscape, they say that's not a landscape. It's only the confidence and the knowledge of the drawer, of knowing like how to go towards the landscape from there, that makes that possible, that they have that confidence. And that is something that we're lacking in the sense of organization, being able to just draw these lines, not to yet see the whole thing we're creating, but be knowledgeable that these things are progressing. And that's so important. So yeah, I'm very much in agreement with your comments.
Yeah, and I just for my finishing up, because I now found back the words of finishing, which is in a way just what you said. There was a previous exercise, right, trying this kind of vignetting or like going into the thing, and it was maybe a bit difficult for like, and I began here with not knowing what I was doing. I was like, where do I even begin? And then yeah, just kind of doing it was the thing, right? I mean, so that was what I meant to say, but you kind of said it, so I just said it one more time. And now I'm done.
All right.
It's interesting too, because it's like you make the movement, right, and then retroactively you can generate a matrix around it, so it's like the frame is retroactively generated by the act.
I think that's a huge underestimated factor, that retroaction is really the more usual, like, or retrograding is kind of the more usual process. I'm not sure that there's even another one. I'm being a designer by training.
I think it's all retroactive and reflective.
I think yes, I really kind of trust that in a very kind of positive way. If you want to do something new, you have to throw it, you have to push it out into a space that isn't really there. And understanding will kind of gather onto it in a way. It's what I guess.
Yeah, and it's also like just a final comment on this, like from my side, like at one point, I don't know, maybe a year ago, I intentionally made a systematic exploration of different visual artists and their process, precisely in terms of what is the system that is happening with, let's say, drawers that are very capable and kind of confident and have a lot of skills, and how do they drawings form and what kind of systematics you can see, precisely what's happening in their decision process and so on, to take the learnings from that. And I picked drawing and painting because it's one of these forms that has such a long history, so it has a lot of elegance to it. And I can even recommend, there's one YouTube channel I would definitely recommend, because it's a particular drawer who is very good at kind of philosophically approaching what he's doing, what's his process. And he has mostly videos about that. And he draws while he's talking through these arguments. So, and it's very much what you're now describing was amongst these areas. There's that actually it's a sort of putting stuff and then like having this constant, not even retroactive, but simply having the spectrum or the dimension that pulls all the way back through the process, all the way to the ideas, constantly reflecting whatever is at front towards the back. and that being kind of creating a guideline, a navigation for the process itself.
Is that like the front thing you're trying to point to in the text you had written?
No, actually, we'll come to that. I'll have a like
Okay.
once you go through it, we'll go through the front. It kind of touches upon that in terms of concept selection, but there's a couple of other things to it.
I must say one more thing. I apologize to everybody.
No,
but I
please.
must say- To what you just said, Pekko, I think because it's a side note or like a kind of asterisk on the retroactive motion. I think what's at stake and why I think it is kind of interesting to kind of, you know, repeat a little bit that idea of grading, I think is the term that I once read, is that at stake here in this moment where we are talking about that basically decisions are formulative in nature and only appear to be, you know, kind of neutral and mechanic. At stake there is rationality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's super significant now to say that if the process is formulative in nature, then we begin either of something that we have to term differently than rationality because that doesn't fit our frame for rationality, or, which I think is maybe my inclination, we have to submit a certain, or admit a certain rationality to these irrational processes, so to speak, irrational processes. And I think that's for me a pathway that I'm a bit after also with the thesis deck that I'm trying to stuff together in a way, is that these things need to be understood to be not arbitrary. They need to be understood as being integrative, possibly. Or, you know, I don't know what the good word is because I haven't done that, but I think it's highly important to just say that these kind of, I mean, everything that I did today here with this table was doing shit before I knew what I was doing. And that's how I found stuff out. I mean, this is such an easy thing to say, and everybody has said that, but there's a rationale to that, and there's a rationality to that. And this is why I think it's interesting to kind of bend a bit the finger of the post-rationalization, which, you know, used to be a very forbidden term, certainly in design. You were not allowed to go on a bend over stuff that you couldn't kind of a priori explain. I think it's very important to kind of, so I stopped. Thanks.
Yeah.
On that point, please.
Yeah, just there's a link now to the channel I mentioned, the drawer who's called Sukra. And this is how to draw complex things video. And there's others I can put them maybe later in the Telegram group I would recommend, but it's interesting how much allegory there is in how he approaches drawing in his videos. But that's a link to a video and to his channel, of course.
Okay. On the point you were just making, this is a philosopher who I came across a couple of years ago, and I just fell in love with what they were saying. But they're talking about like the concept of reflective disclosure, where like you think back on the conditions of possibility, like the preconditions of possibility for something, and it opens up like the possibility of new worlds. And so it's like, like here he argues that in social criticism or critique ought to incorporate insights about phenomena and reorient around practices of reflective disclosure to have a future worthy of its past, and that like these practices constitute a new department of reason, which is distinct from instrumental reason. Anyway, so he's a fascinating thinker, and like someone I found like super aligned with everything we talk about. He's pretty crazy.
The guy is definitely. This Charles Taylor, or is that this Nicholas
Nicholas Compelis.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was on that point. Like I really highly recommend that. and just cause, yeah, it's just cool. So this year, this is like, I've been trying to spend the past, like, I don't know, the past week or 2 weeks, I've been trying to like dig up through old notes and like see how we can use some stuff for card stuff. So me and Pekka have been talking about that. But yeah, so like this, like just digging up some old things and trying to put them together. But I've been, one of the things you were a lot of the stuff you were saying, Martin, like made me think of this operation table here. And so like this is like a concept that from abstract, I'm trying to work my way through abstract algebra and like just mess around with like the notions. It's not to say that like that the things I'm saying are like mathematically correct or anything, but I've been finding it like pretty interesting to like understand, just to test, just playing around with the concepts, I guess. And so I found like the operation table is pretty interesting because you just take a group, like a set of elements, like a set of cards, right? So each one of these is cards. I wish I could zoom in. And so here we've got like 1, -1, I, and -I, and they can combine across, like, you just take the same set and then you just multiply it by itself, create every permutation of combination. But what's interesting with these group tables is that like you can have like the operation by which you're doing to those elements can be anything. So like it could also be another card, you know? So it's like what happens when you multiply this card by that card, or when you take this card and not multiply, but you card a card to another card, you know? And so I've been looking at this as like a way of doing like card combinatorics,
Yes.
and seeing how we can like mess around with that. It's interesting in like the normal group stuff when we're talking about math. There are like rules for these tables as to what are the possible places that something can be in, and where it's like you don't necessarily know beforehand whether these things are going to be in what place, and so but you have certain rules. So I'm thinking like here, one of the rules is that you can't have the same thing. Every column contains the identity element that like can be operated onto anything, but the thing remains the same as it was before. So like that's the identity element, like 1, right? The number 1, you multiply that to anything, is the same thing as it was before. And so there has to be an identity element in every row, you know? Like these are super speculative thoughts, you know, and I don't know if there's like an immediate direct thing, but I've been finding it interesting because it's like, if we go beyond math, right? Like how can we view these, like, how can we like operate with these, like with combinatoric grids with rules as to like what would happen, like where do you place certain things, you know, or something. And it's just a way to spark the imagination and then fill in. Yeah, so I've been finding that interesting. It reminded me a bit about what you were doing with the grid there. Because like these rules are like a filter, you know. Yeah.
And yeah, that's actually really cool that you brought this, like, because it's also like a very useful structure. The one thing which is a kind of interesting development if you add to this, is that there is a particular operation which, to my understanding, is not part of this sort of conventional tables, but probably is somewhere somebody has pointed this out, which is that there is a way to build identity, and a certainly component of identity, which is that it remains the same.
Yeah.
But there is another, but there is another operation, which is that something is modified and comes to be replace or extend that location, like that it's not anymore the same, but it's taken in the same position. And this is, of course, like this traces all the, you know, this is the core of Deleuze's difference and repetition, because it's in the title, and of course it's the core of early Derrida as well. I mean, it's the core function that leads to dissemination in Derrida style dissemination and so on. And that's not to say that this is better, but rather it's an interesting expansion of this thinking, how it's two different styles of operations, and what kind of limitations, and on the other hand, what kind of potential can come from something is recognized as changed yet identity. The value changes, but it actually comes to the same position, and often leads to actually kind of not erasing the earlier, but pushing it down, therefore creating a history. It was this, now it's that. Because that's a lot of human process is very dependent on this. When you see the person again, it's not the same, but the operation you do now, this is pushed to be that person, and in containing that this was that person, now that is that person, now they have blue hair or whatever it is.
I just, between you two, just let me insert here this kind of thing, because I think this is a little bit or very actually interesting in maybe the like what you're bringing there also, or what you have been bringing us. Pekka, you were saying that in the saved state, right, earlier today, you bring in interpretation.
Yeah. And
so now, Leo, you're bringing in mathematical functions, which is like, with rules. And so there's an interesting thing that I think we're working on for some time, without having maybe discussed this so frontally. What are rules in this way, maybe in this infidel way, that are then open to interpretation? Or where does the one begin and the other end, And I think that's really interesting, and I just want to kind of branch out to one more thing. Pekka, you were saying earlier that history is logic. I'm not sure that I completely understood your thread there, but one thing that history is then also is the memory of those logics, right? And then there is something that I think is really at stake in this moment, in this kind of immutable ledger kind of era. Where is misunderstanding? Where is that left? And how can we take care that that's kind of, that we remember to forget, that we remember to misunderstand, that we remember to, identity, but with change? There's a very interesting complexity that cannot miss either of the two, but that needs to be kind of, so to speak, gardening both.
Yeah, they're two different. Yeah, they're two different directions. Like both important. Like in a way, like the history being a logic is like, if you take that ledger, immutable or not, but we can look at the immutable one. The fact that it is a ledger is based on interactions that create the ledger, modify the ledger. And those operations are foundational. The ledger is the product out of those logic, which sets that history is logic first, and then creates a result of the ledger. So in this sense, therefore the history is logic foundationally, and that's one branch. You're opening another branch, which is this: what is the interpretational scope, and how that can apply, and what is interpretational and what is set, which is a question of rules and organization in the first place. And both branches are important, but and both should be considered as possible.
I think I wanted to kind of, I'm zero competent in that domain. Maybe that, pre-digital, so to speak, practice of history was incubated, so to speak, with misunderstanding at all times, because it had to go.
Yeah.
It was going through reading or, whatever, transcribing, and there's mistakes always in that. And that's a very healthy thing, I think. That's like, genetically very, very, very powerful. Now we're in a different paradigm. And so I think kind of the degree of care over either of which, you speak of two branches, may have to just be adjusted a little. So this is, I'm not sure if I'm making a point. I just felt that I needed to say.
Yeah, that's the one branch. But also, like, if you look at the history of history and the study of history, you can see that once you come to more contemporary history, there is this essentially, it's not put in those terms, but like ultimately creates a pattern of becoming more and more aware that there is unavoidably always a logic that creates the history. This whole conversation of, but how is this history produced?
I'm always going to preach Hegel with that self-understanding concept, coming conscious of itself. Like.
Let's say Hegel was quite a bit in front of like the actual field of history coming to this realization. Like Hegel was
the card of the concept.
Yeah. Hegel
Right.
was speaking in this
the absolute
terms,
idea.
Yeah, like the practice of history, maybe in the but in the last 100 years has very much become much more actively aware and having a discourse about these logics. They don't call them logics, but ultimately that's it. I'm not saying logic strictly, but logic-like thing is at the core of any production of history, and that's the fundament. And then the history is produced from that. Although, in the case of human history, these have a kind of a dialogue. You produce some text of history, and then you evaluate it by what was my logic, and you maybe change the production or change the logic. So it's not like an absolute first and absolute second, but nevertheless, it has that element of logic that then leads to the production of a history of a certain kind, because it's always a certain kind.
There's a point here on retroactivity that ties in with this operation table here, which I find pretty interesting. These rules that are on the sides, that are the rules for like a normal group, and they aren't there before, they're there after, meaning that like the only way that these rules are derived, like because and not having these rules leads to inconsistencies, meaning that like where I equals -1, right, or 1 equals -1. So it's like these rules are like retroactive to like just trying it, seeing, and then if it was not that, it wouldn't work, and I think this extends, like, I think this kind of approach to like the rule making in like a card combinatoric grid, part of me is feeling like there's something there in terms of like how do we find the set of rules for doing combinations of cards that don't lead to like violations of identity or something. I don't know. Maybe sometimes you want that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like design toolbox. There is certainly a strength if you find persistent rules, essentially. And if you don't have any persistence to rules, you lose. That is certainly kind of losing certain kind of expressive capability and operational capability. On the other hand, like there are situations where even this sort of changing of rules and them being kind of dynamic in their expression is a strength of its own, with its own weaknesses. So it's more like this consideration of design and what is useful in whatever case. I think in many situations you probably see hybrids that have like something from very strict persistence staying in the same form, like repetitive iteration, to somewhere into being very dynamic and constantly changing, and those collaborating.
There's a so one of like the so this is like I'll send this paper in the group, and like yeah, I obviously extend invitation to collab and everything on all of that. But yeah, like I think this is the one of the parts of the paper that I'm finding the most fascinating. And it's about like, imagine an expression between subject, where every single part of this phrase, right, that has a subject, a predicate, or an object, you know, where a predicate can be like an operation or a transformation. So like this is kind of tied to the table too. Is like each one of these is an empty object onto which we project perceived object properties. And then we have a perception of the possible transformations that can occur from them, from certain expressions understood as like the subject, predicate, object, card as operation frame, right? Where I'm saying I'm playing this card, like from this card, maybe it's the card that is me as the subject that is doing this operation card on the object card, right? So it's always this triple. And so that this expression has these changes when we receive it. And so I've got the perceived set of possible properties that the object has, and the perceived set of possible transformations that it could have. So that in itself is pretty interesting. But what we get from there, and that the context is also this, right? And so what expression? So it's like, what expression can I say that actually would transform the context? We're not playing tennis anymore. We're playing basketball. Once like I don't know, you know, once we do something, it's something else, right? And what filters are we using to look at through these object properties to frame an expression within a context? But so where this gets very fascinating, and I think and it's just like something I want to throw out there, because maybe some ideas will come out over the next couple of weeks from whatever. So like once we have a perceived object property, and so this goes back to the concept of symmetry. Once we have a perceived object property that remains unchanged after a transformation or an operation, and we have a perceived set of possible transformations, you can derive the types of symmetries that are possible for the subject object, because they are perceived properties of the object. So we're not really talking about like a mathematical object. We're talking about an object with perceived object properties and perceived sets of possible transformations. So these are subjective objective symmetries, subject-object symmetries, and maybe even intersubjective, interobjective. And once you have the symmetries, then you actually have the types of identities that the subject-object can have. So it's like, oh, when I play this card, when I do this card when I play the 9, and I play it this way, then it continues to have the property of being in the game in this context. So there's a symmetry there, like, and that remains unchanged after this operation. So like, to what extent does these symmetries define like the being in the game or the being in the context, you know? And like, but if I show you the card, then the card is no longer part of the game, right? That's another example where an operation like actually transformed the object's property as like it being inside of a certain context. And so, yeah, like that's like the symmetry thing. Like what happens when we start speaking in these identities that are like, this goes back to the concept of retroactivity, right? Because it's like, it's not that if we derive our identities this way, instead of positing them beforehand, then it's like what is an identity is always retroactive to finding out the symmetries.
Mhm.
So it's like, it's not that I'm calling this the 9 of hearts first. It's that like, what are all the ways in which I can play it? That what remains the same, and those things I can use as identity.
Yes.
So that's pretty interesting. And then as a final point, just as a final point, what we can get from here is that we can do composition. So once the set of transforms, operations, or expressions or predicates, or just expressions, I don't know, under which an object is symmetric, form a group. And this is the symmetry group of the subject object. So once we start like using, these identities that are derived retroactively through these symmetries, then and then we add significations to them, I think we enter like a very interesting space, a very interesting and playful space at the level of like object persistence and like what it means for something to be. Yeah, and then just the fact that like with the group of symmetries, the identity element that we were talking about, the identity element in the group of symmetries is just not doing anything. Whenever you have a group of symmetries, the transformation of not doing anything is what keeps the thing the same. Although that, when we're talking about subject object, that might not always be the case. Anyway, I mean, I don't know. This is just some stuff I've been exploring, and yeah, again, I'll paste this in the docs in the group. I really would love to see how we can bridge like some card discourse and like some of this discourse here. Yeah, because I think it stands a lot to benefit being able to derive these symmetries and then derive the identities and then use those to talk. I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, there is. I definitely agree, and I even have a small contribution. I can do it when I share the screen to point out how precisely what you're saying is very visible in, I mean, particularly board game design, because board games have this nice quality that they kind of have their bones visible in a way, like because the game has to be run by people. So you see the systems very much in the front. So I don't have a super good picture because I was kind of summoning it at the moment of the game, because there's a new version of this game called the Bazaar, and it's a much better looking, and more clear, or elegant presentation. But this should work. Maybe I can use either this or so. Maybe use this. So the game is super simple, and I'll just highlight while telling it how it kind of outlines with what Leo was pointing out structurally. So this game is really like, in addition, what you see on the screen, each player has this like real little tokens that are the colors that you see here in the images, like blue, green, and white, and so on. So it has these mappings of transformations. This is also a good example of Leo's signification as transformation, connecting our earlier talk. And then these cards, which are actually valid patterns. So how it plays is like, in the beginning, I don't remember if you have any of these tokens. Maybe you have, no, I think you have randomly one color, like maybe you have white or green. Then you can make a move, which is you can either roll a dice, which gives you a particular color of a token. You see the dice in the left, like a red one or a blue one, or a wild card where you can select which color you pick. So you can do that. Or the other thing is you can do what could be called translation. It is, let's say you got randomly a blue token. So you have a blue token. Up in the top, you see one blue token can be translated into yellow and white at the very top row of the left. So you could, as then the move, do I take my blue token and give it away, and I get yellow and white. Now, why are you doing this? Is because like underneath you see there's 4 cards, sorry, and they are valid patterns. So what you need is you need essentially for the leftmost 2 blue tokens, 2 white tokens, and a green one. And once you have all of those, you fulfill that card, and that card, you get the card, and that gives you points. There's an extra condition in this game that if you're left with 0 tokens after that, like if you completely fulfill your stack, you get the most points. And if you have collected extras, you get less points. So you have to be as efficient as possible with your translations. And that's the whole game. Like some winning conditions, how many points, and so on top of that is that you start with, say, a 1 token. What you're looking at through these translations to work towards the patterns. Once you fulfill the pattern, you get points, and you also take that card away, revealing the next pattern. That pattern disappears, so the players are trying to be fast with it. But how this is kind of correlating with what Leo is saying, if you think about this game, there is a persistence here, which makes the game. That is, like, first of all, there is a persistence that there are always these translations, let's call them. But there is I think about 10 these big cards, which are set in the beginning of the game, setting different configurations of translation. So translation always. But what translations changes by game from a limited set. Similarly, the valid patterns that you can play are always there, but which ones changes even more rapidly, but comes from a limited set. And so the whole design is playing with persistence, playing with limited set persistence, leading to dynamics. And the design couldn't work if it wouldn't be using this things that are completely persistent, things that are persistent to a range, things that are persistent until fulfilled. That's how the game is created. And for me, it's a good reflection on this, how you need precisely this collaboration of strong persistence and then a gradient towards high variance, often with different types of varying, often from limited sets, to actually create an interaction in itself. So it's a very pure example of this, the game.
Yes, and I would love to see this game in motion, because I can hear when you're saying like that there's definite connect, like I hear that there's like that what you're saying like totally matches up, that I have trouble visualizing it.
Yeah, I can post a video, because that's why I know it's a new edition, because somebody made a review of the new edition recently. So that contains how it plays. So
it definitely also makes me think of like sorry.
No, do say.
Yeah, like what you were saying about like the signification thing we were talking about. We were like so in a conversation me and Pego were having, we were going through the that other doc, and we were talking about how we've got these different patterns, and then like we have significations on those things, and that those can change.
Yeah.
And like this, yeah, I mean, this seems like such a crystallized just explanation of it, honestly.
Yeah, you can read it as blue signifies white and yellow. That's really it, like in this connection, which is
wow, dude, this game dynamic is so on the nose, I feel, for like explaining these things.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, like, and one can say the designer, I think it's Sid Jackson. I can figure that. I think it's Sid Jackson. He's quite famous, and this was kind of like his minimum game, like how to create this one interaction that becomes an interesting game in itself, in like enough intricacy and complexity. So the design is quite elegant. Like some people think like, oh, you should put this in the core of a game and then produce more around it, which is certainly true. You could do that, but it's also kind of this sort of design challenge that you create this sort of elegant interaction that in itself is speaking about elemental interactions in and of itself. And interestingly, he's kind of in the signification territory with that.
I would love to try to work towards an implementation of this kind of structure using the copoesis like as a first utilization, I guess, of the code, because it's like we could replace these tokens with anything, where like we have patterns, objects, images, whatever. We create a board of that dictionary mapping between like what are the signs and what are the significations. Like these are the different boards,
you
know, and then these cards are the I'm having trouble understanding the cards, but
so the card is really why are you doing the significations translations in the first place. You're working yourself through them to have a set that exactly fits the set of the card. Like for example, if you were working on towards the one card with 2 blues, 2 whites, and green, and you had say you had like the what could be a good choice. Well, you could, for example, if you had the red, you could take from the right, second from the bottom, you get 2 blues and 2 yellows. So now you have the 2 blues, but then you have 2 yellows, which are extra. You don't quite get to that pattern in itself. But then your next.
This is also a pattern matching game.
Yes, it is very much.
So, okay, so this would be very interesting to try to implement as like a first thing, because it's like we can, not only can we test the dictionary with the significations, but we can also like talk about what like the player as a pattern matcher, you know, and as a recognizer or signifier, you know.
Yeah.
So I be a very interesting game dynamic for testing that out and like going beyond the colors, you know.
Yeah, I like something like here the sort of elemental interaction is interesting in its relation. It's not meaning that it has to stay there, but it's interesting how it kind of puts it like that. But it also like how it correlates with parts what you were saying about the kind of permanence, persistence, like how a rule iterates as the same rule, and how that's important in this game to create the identity, but also how it utilizes that in multiple fashions, like this top cards. Like if in the beginning of the game you get a different one, it might have that the blue translates to say red and a yellow, not white and a yellow. So then the configuration is the game is different. So but it's still like it's persistence within a range. There is a full persistence, which is there's always this translation, always the significance, signification. What things signify changes, but from a limited range.
Yeah, this is beautiful. I'll try to write the code with this game in mind. I think I'm making that commitment right now.
Okay, I'll post you the video because you get the full rules. It's a well-made how to play video, and that provides a bridge. So let's see if I might be the least abstract this time. That would be a feat, but I'll just shortly point out some interesting things towards the fronts side of things, and why there is actually something that could be played once again. Probably we don't have the time this time to play them, but why I picked them, and made a new version of the fronts concept. Maybe the key thing, since you can see my screen, is scroll to the right. So in the description of the OXL called front, the type called front, in the description there is like the fronts emulate organizations as roles to play. And this is actually
a quick
what
question before Pekko, just a quick question before you go further so that I don't miss the thing. Do I need to know something about fronts before? Is that an existing concept that I'm not aware of?
No, this is why I'm starting on this page, which is history.
Check.
But I will do a very short history on it. So fronts actually come from Apocalypse World. But I like this particular. This is from the system reference document of Dungeon World. I like how they do fronts, like for various reasons that are not important right now. But as a function, as an operative concept, as they were set in Apocalypse World, what they were essentially doing was to create this sort of often almost self-operating emulations of organizations. And that makes them interesting because rather than creating a whole organization, you're kind of creating a thing that is small, but kind of behaves like an organization would. And this was kind of interesting to me because I had similar thought patterns through where Martin was going through. And this was for me an interesting avenue to speculate about, like, what if one creates fronts mechanics and creates different ways to play them? Is it kind of a way to kind of quickly sketch out organizations? Certainly not the only way, but an interesting way towards that. And to pull a note from the end of this, I would say yes, but we'll get to the yes. So, okay, but I'll just to point to this history. So fronts are also interesting because they're kind of dirty pattern, but also kind of interesting one in how they are built. So how to create the front is essentially a template in the earlier sense of a template. So for example, from here you start what is essentially a title, which is kind of identifier type for the front, and then you put what is called an impulse. So so if you look here, I'll underline it. The title is religious organization, which of course would be titled further as a particular religious organization. But then it's given an impulse, which is to establish and follow doctrine. Could be something else, but what this impulse is essentially doing is setting a thematic operation. So now you have a kind of an entity. Maybe you named a religious organization, but it has this constant vector, a thematic vector, which is to establish and follow doctrine. Of course, you could rewrite that. If you think that's not good enough, you just change the impulse, or you add more impulses. Rarely used, but of course a possibility. Like you can have bullet points. Yeah,
I really like the psychoanalytic, like, you know,
yeah,
this like an impulse to something.
Yeah, and it's this is also like this whole branch of game design is full of this sort of actually quite interesting and elegant analytics towards operations. Not to set like this is category always this, but set like a style of operation. And while they're dirty, they are often very, very useful and very pragmatically functional, good tools. So it's a very simple package to say religion organization this, and then set this impulse, which for the play of it is this creating this constant checking point, going back to our recursion thoughts of like, oh, like if I'm thinking what they're doing, I can always start from this impulse to establish and follow doctrine. But then they also, underneath that, have moves. And this is the most simple way of moves. Like here, for the game, for example, they could make a move of influence a powerful institution, change a law, manipulate doctrine, establish a new rule within the organization. claim a territory or resources, negotiate a deal. And this is once again a kind of template for the player, which could be the game master in this case. Is like okay, I have the sense of this organization, and per their impulse, they might be establishing a new rule within their organization. What could that rule be? So you're kind of going through the corridor of I make this move, then I figure out the details of that move. And now the organization, of course, has changed, but also has made an operation in the world, which resembles an organization, even though you don't actually have the organization. You're making it function like an organization without having the internals, which is interesting. And or they wanting to influence another organization, which is another front for you, and that might be through changing of a law. And once again, this list of moves is something that you just make into a palette. You don't maybe pick all of this, maybe you make your own. But that gives you this sort of checking list. Like, I think there are now trying to claim territory or resources because they are too small. So that's what they want to do. What could they do on that side? So then you follow that move in itself. So the move palette is a very easy controllative way of branching out activities, operations from them. But there is a further structure, which here is called dangers, but I've started hacking at this point, which I just call them arcs. Actually, it's called like dangers, but then grim portents, impending doom. I kind of clean that up. So the grim portents is something I started calling arcs, because that's what they really are. So here's an example of the grim portent, which is like, here is an example of a college. I think it's a wizard college, but something to that extent. But it isn't this bullet point list, but it's also a sequence. So you to create for this organization, not just these moves, but a certain kind of an arc of development, which if nothing else happens, if they're not disturbed, this is the pathway they move on. And it also says, look, you might change this pathway if things change, but it essentially sets them not just moves, but kind of arcs that they're going through. So here it's the college sends an expedition to the gate. There is a gate described earlier. The key is discovered because there's a key in the at the gate. The first trumpet sound, very apocalyptic. A champion is chosen. Second trumpet sounds, herald appears, and the gate is opened. So, but like in this system, there is only one of these pathways. But when you approach this as arcs, you can think of the arcs like plugins, which can start to create, once again, this sort of more sequential and serialized patterns of development, which they might follow or not. And they might have their own condition which they follow, which further expands the kind of organization-like behavior that can come from this. So there's a couple of other elements, but then to point out, like,
Martin, your audio is
yeah, we cannot hear you, Martin.
Better now?
Yes.
No?
yes.
Then okay. I was just asking if I could attempt a quick recap just to see that I'm in the boat. So like in that context that you just looked at, fronts are basically parts of a game, fake organizations that you need kind of to equip the game. Is that correct?
Fake but operate.
Exactly.
Like,
so like fake by fake, I mean like a cheap, like simulated NPC type organization, which is not the
That's
main
a really
issue.
great way of putting it.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah.
It really, and again, towards this impulse thing, right? It really makes me think of like how these impulses are stupid, right? They're like they're dumb, like but necessary impulses.
Yeah, and but also because like Leo knows that I sometimes or was it with you? I can't remember. This week I've talked about the dials. I think I mentioned it with you. Like, I like designs that have dials in the right place, that they're easy to change. So for example, the impulse, if it's always a little bit on the dumb side, kind of intentionally, because it also makes it quick to use, but you can turn it deeper by adding more impulses and maybe adding conditions of under which conditions they follow a particular impulse. You have a little bit more system, but you can start from the simple and then give depth as you need. So this is a good dial because it's precisely answering to potential needs. So I like a lot of this design, which is precisely why I kind of took it and started generalizing and kind of expanding it. So yeah, but yes, Martin, your characterization is kind of how I think about it, and that's kind of what I tried to shortly communicate with the word emulates. Just up front,
like a front is a facade. That's the same word.
Yeah,
almost.
yeah, but once again, operative facade. Like it's
Exactly.
not just like a dead image. It's actually an operating
dead image. That's also very good.
Yeah. So
Dead.
yeah, like so what I and this is, you know, all 0.2 or maybe a little bit further, but so like not ready, but like essentially the title is a name that identifies, works as an identifier and characterizes. So it's good to actually give names that kind of push already some definition, but then there is the impulse, or the optional other label could be vector, maybe some others, but then also this is kind of modification from the original front, which is they have sometimes what is called stakes, but they're really questions, which is that you can also put like a question of whether the organization let's say finds a way to come to unity or disbands into conflicted factions. Now, this question is intentionally directional. What it's pushing is, oh, now the play will address that question, which makes it more likely that they will come to this kind of crossroads, that they either maybe unify or separate or fracture, or maybe stay in between, but that question will be on the play. So that gives a further tool. So you have the impulse, which has more directionality, but the question is more like contouring the landscape. That is, and then you have the moves, which is kind of pushing like certain operations. But then you can plug in these arcs, which is like, oh, actually now there's something that is not one move, but I want to create this sort of pattern of behavior, which is typical for organizations. So then I plug in an arc and I call the arc this. It's like in the early example, it was them in the dungeon world front, it was the where are my wasn't that here? So it was the pathway of them getting interested in the gates, opened this arc of expedition first to the gate, then discovering the key from the gate that leading to operations, etc., and so on. So so similarly, like you can think of such structures and plug in an arc, but then you could have more arcs if you need them. And then I intentionally separated this early part that I described as a kind of a core, which is like more like in the sense of this persistence and stability. If you're creating a front, you're probably putting all of these things. I mean, you can leave one out, but you're generally starting from that basic template. But then these further patterns are kind of plugins, like the arcs. But then I started putting other patterns that could be plugged into this, which create new behaviors and therefore create more possibilities for organized behavior. But these are not in the original fronts at all anymore, but like this plugin approach is really not its thing. It's kind of something that it's missing. So I made a pattern called seed and seed holder, which is that it has I mean, this, I have to clean this up, but the basic idea I think is sound, is like for the organization, you can always, from any process that it's part of, you can extract a seed, which is like, let's say in this conversation, what would have been a term that people highlighted? Can anybody name? Because there were multiple things that people kind of said, oh, that's important, or that's interesting, like a thought.
Identity.
What's right?
Identity.
Identity, for example, or like how identity is a pattern that comes from something that remains or iterates. So that could be a seed. Of course, just the word identity could also be a seed. It's not controlling that, but I'll take the slightly more content one. And then you put it in a kind of a holder that the organization has on its side, which it can plug in. And it could put this sentence and maybe other material associated to it as a kind of a nugget in its holder. Which means that it kind of becomes important to it. Inside the holder, you can organize by essentially tagging. You could say it's, let's say, maybe they make a tag called identity, and then they put a seed inside there, which is called elements that remain or stay persistent through changes, as is the seed underneath there. And then having that holder and having that tag in there of identity, then let's say instigates more things collected underneath there. Like now, then one is likely to add another seed towards and tag it to identity. Of course, one can create new text in there. And then there is various processes. I made a simple process of processing seeds, which is a hack from a kind of a clue mechanism from another game, which is that one can always engage in the session that you take a collection of seeds, maybe under one tag, maybe your own collection, and you create this essentially process seed session of play where there's a move to relate seeds, saying, okay, the identity, let's say you have that things that remain the same, then you might have some other elements there, like you have like images that you have made from board games where you have highlighted things that remain the same in the board game and then call them identity of these games. That's its own seed. And then you start relating the seeds that you have. And everybody can make a move where they express a relation. Like I see shared aspects between these, or I can see a crossbreed between these two seeds, or I can see a continuation or correlation between this seed and another. So that's one move that is possible in this session of processing seeds. The other move is grow from seeds, which is like whenever you come up with a good combination of the seeds, you can express this as an outcome. Is like, we discovered through comparing the seeds that there are certain typical patterns in these board games that actually create their identity. And then you express that, and that's, you can think of it as a growth from the seed or refined seed, better terms to be defined. But like, of course, the process could be more complicated, but that's another process that is kind of organization-like, but super simple. You have to just this holder collector that has a super simple organization of tags, and then you have the simple processes where you essentially refine from them by relating them, and then taking what is refined and naming that, and maybe putting it back to the holder. So now with this title, impulse, the questions, moves, the arcs being able to plug in and being able to plug in this sort of holders and collect seeds to them, it's of course it's more complex, but it's still not super complex. but it's creating a lot of organizational behavior. And I think it's fascinating. And I could even now run a game session, which also has loops, because the seed processing has a kind of a loop in itself. And you could create loops of such organizations in and of themselves. So it provides this interesting way of introducing this lazily emulated kind of surface from surface forward functioning organizations into games, which one can translate once they start get interesting into more real functioning organizations. For example, one could do other things with them as well, but yeah, it's fairly like it's already at the point of can be used, but certainly can be made better, and other plugins can be added to make it even further. Yeah, we can play test it. I was like, if we would have time, we could have play tested it today, but we can play test it next time, certainly. Like, because I think it works. Because the fronts work in the games. They are like game designers circles have a high regard of the front concept. So making a clear expansion of the fronts, because they have kind of stagnated, and generalization of fronts is, I think, rather interesting game design wise as well.
Martin, your audio.
Yep.
Jesus, hello.
Yes, now you're. It always starts bad, but it gets better.
Yeah, that's like my life. I have one question and one thought to this. The thought is that you're almost through kind of, should I say, refining or kind of fleshing out the kind of behavioral side of the front. I think you're bringing it close to, or it's coming close to where you could almost have that run, quasi autonomously, like in a simulation mode.
Yeah.
And I think like a game testing, like Leo said, it would be really funny kind of on a kind of, if it's possible to run on a crude base, to try and kind of, because these seeds, there's a kind of sense of like, like a slot, like an input slot, like I need this to happen, and then I can, do the next step as that organization, which I zombie-like am. And so like one could kind of almost set up like a small, like a terracotta army of fronts.
Yes.
And see what that could be a fun thing to do on the website. Yes. I have such ideas for the website, like that were kind of text-based, that the website would react in a way, you're thrown into the website and there's just a cursor, and like a Apple II kind of interface, starting interface. You just have to type stuff and hope that the thing catches any of what you're saying, like a non-neural network language processor, but like, so that could be a funny way to kind of make these kind of front robot battles, or not battles, not as a battle, not as a fight, but like just what happens.
100% like NPC war, like not war, but like, who knows, it's like because it's like I don't know, the way I'm seeing it with like it's like a minimal phantasmatic screen on which I can project and like what are my minimal like death impulses? I create some kind of structure and symbolic structure, minimal, and then I'm just like playing around with it inside of like these simulations. The pattern
to kind of this, like, I mean, I don't know if it's realistic, if it can be done on a minimal way, but like to kind of, maybe we can define a type of minimal set of attributes and functions that such things could have, and then I want to show you a picture, because I think I will share that on the on the Telegram in a second, but I need to show it to you now because I think it resembles quite well what I mean to talk about. Come on.
Do you want to share it on screen or do you use the chat?
Maybe I would
Well,
try to share it.
whichever. I think you still have the rights to share. So.
Wait, let the light adjust. Yeah, okay, I see. We're seeing it.
Oh yes.
Oh,
Yes.
like these are the characters.
Yes.
That's what I did with my son today, but like that we could bring, because I mean they're made from 3 elements basically.
Yeah.
And so just to say, like, next time or the past next time we meet, everybody has, you know, kind of like a basket full of these kind of idiotic NPC type of things, and we all toss them into arena, and then the only thing that we can do is kind of spit out some
words,
and
whatever reacts first reacts. I think that could be super funny.
Yeah, and it's actually like that's actually kind of where I'm going, because I have other places to steal and hack from. So first of all, Martin's comment on the website, you could easily do this sort of, because like the dumbness is also an asset or strength. Like if you would make a randomizer that selects an impulse from a list of 10 and then selects the moves from another list, you could create these random ones. Some of them would be nonsensical, of course, as always happens with random or stochastic generation. But it's possible enough that you could kind of get different ones with slight controlled randomness, that is stochastic. That's one possibility. But then I have a couple of directions towards when you're talking about the sort of them playing against each other. There is a couple of sources. So first of all, my next step is to steal from 2 games, which is Stars Without Number and Worlds Without Number, because they have a approach which they call domain level play, but it's essentially a kind of slightly different approach of organizations playing in the background of players. And it has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, but I think with this front approach, one can convert, one has to change the mechanics a bit, but what it can bring is precisely the sort of them taking actions by themselves. So that's my next yet to be started hacking project, to steal the domain play mechanics and change them from there, because they're quite good in their own way. But then there is another direction, which is the, well, so-called solo play. Like this has been an area that has been developing rapidly, is this sort of like people playing this sort of world generating games solo, like alone. And there are kind of interesting mechanics of how to do such plays by system generation. You don't have another player, so the system generates things for you that are like essentially generating a world. So from those 2 sources, like the different mechanics of solo play and the different engines, which funnily enough they call emulators, like people emulators. And then this sort of Stars Without Number, Worlds Without Number, domain play, and the moves that the and how to make these sort of factions, they call them, making moves. I think one can get to that point. So I think like there is something really interesting in this direction, also as a game, because this kind of play, of course, it can go into many directions, and it has probably many strong games in it. But one interesting 2-button press that it does is it might be interesting to play, but also what results from that play can be interesting. That is the organizational ideas. And so like this has always been a strength that role-playing games have thrived upon, whereas many other games have kind of overlooked. Like even a board game, often, even though it might be brilliant, it's like nothing comes out of the game other than you feeling good because you won or lost. But if that game generates something like, oh, now I'm left with this organizational ideas, and I actually start to maybe play this hacky version even as a hacky version, or maybe I kind of add some depth where I'm actually kind of working like a real organization, but only at points, not in every part of that organization that the game generated. That is a very important possibility that is really kind of opens up the sort of gameplay beyond just games for themselves, for the sake of themselves.
I'm really interested in this, in like, yeah, like how you're talking about like the role, right? And then the role as an impulse, right? As like yeah, as an impulse. And then that like by taking on the role and like enacting a kind of desire or impulse, you create an organization. And so like then like what organizations do we get? Like how do those organizations structure our desire, you know? And like that, like I'm just thinking about like how the impulse can change form, it can create organizations that crystallize it, and like now you have a desire, you know, to be, because the organization creates a desire, you know, what's possible or impossible at the time.
And you can also set rules to that, like to make a simple example is like every time you make a move in this organization, you can recheck the impulse, like do you want to update it or not?
Yeah, which is part of like this process, the seed process, right?
Yeah
that's one of the
and that has dials. You can say like every 10 moves you can recheck it, and now it's more stable. Like, so you can set it to be more potentially variating or more persistent with kind of simple rule conditions. Now we cannot hear you. Now you're coming through.
Yeah. So and plus this kind of the kind of fantastic side to that, meaning that now in the document that you showed, it was kind of, you know, low cost, cognitively low cost kind of replications of, you know, simple interpretation of existing organizations. Like a church would do that, a cult would do that, and so. But you know, who knows what kind of fungal impulses or woody impulses we can find. You know, like all these, because that I think is where you get to the painting part that I think is really can be really, really interesting. And I just wanted to say two more things. Like one could be already funny on a game, like, you know, existing game thing, to almost have like a commentator, like in a football game, as a kind of recording device, because like you say, like, you know, nothing comes out of a board game, but there is, of course, many things that, you know, are at play. So this is not like a fantastic idea, but I think behind that might be, you know, some kind of curious idea. I was once thinking in a residency format to have one resident in whose only job is to kind of observe and document the thing, you know, who they wouldn't be part of other projects. Anyway,
they could be casting the thing as well, as in sportscaster.
That's what I mean. This type of thing. Yeah. Not in. I wasn't thinking in time. That could also be very funny. It's kind of but what I meant. Sorry, the second one was.
There's also the way you inscribe. You know, like that's like also that the role of a fungal recorder.
Yes. Also, the impulse of a fungal recorder. Yes, exactly. So yeah, I think there's a lot of fertile soil there.
Exactly that.
Shit, I lost the more interesting point though. I forgot. Maybe I find it back.
So you had the commentator, caster.
Yeah.
And what was it related to?
Yeah, that whole thing that we've been talking about. I will have to find it back through some other corner. I will just jump
sports casting, right?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't that. It was something really different. Anyway.
Yeah. We'll see. So Jakub, like, I know your conditions are not the easiest, but before you leave, and I think we're finishing anyway, but do you have some commentator cast. You don't have to cast this, but
I'm not sure if you can hear me because I'm in a cafeteria.
we can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear? Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I was not engaging much actively. I was more because I was not finding my let's say possible points of entry or relevance, because for me, like from the observer perspective, we were kind of like dipping in different disciplines like jiu-jitsu and cellular biology and mathematics, and like peeking into the language or patterns, of which there are infinity of interesting patterns, and kind of branching and exploring. And for me, I had several perhaps ideas what to bring in or relate, but I just couldn't bring myself too much to do it, because for example, I was thinking, oh, how could this relate to game theory, or how could this relate to dog anatomy, or how could this relate to the plasma physics, or something like that. And then, so I guess it was it was kind of for me, and this is the question. I mean, it's still very useful process for me, because I'm having reflections right around it, like, oh, this reflects my ADHDness, or kind of fracturedness of my thought processes, and then I'm, oh, perhaps it is not fractured, perhaps it's just how I perceive it, because something like that. Anyway, so that were but I was writing a lot of notes, and actually also one topic which I wanted to bring, but perhaps there will be time for it, was that we have a visiting lecturer, and she is like doing social technical imaginations, using interaction design and like simple machines. And we were doing a process where we just got like very simple machines, we built them. They were responding to, they're called yo-yo machines. I will share it. Yo-yo machines.io. And
What?
I'm sharing the link. I think it's like this.
It's not coming up. It's not coming up.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah, yo-yo-machines.io. He sent it. Yeah.
Oh, it's best without the dash actually. So I will share it once more. Sorry. And what I found was like really interesting, because she was framing some of the let's say explorations in a bit similar way to how we approach things here. So for example, she said, oh, so we need to be developing our imagination, like social technical imagination, in more systematic ways, and interaction design is one of those. And if we use those very simple machines, then we can like refine our processes. And so we did this simple exercise. So we just took this simple machine, one of those yo-yo machines, and we started generating ideas and framings using the new metaphor framework. So we took the metaphors from the I don't know if you know, I think I might have shared it, metaphor yes. And so we took some metaphors and we tried framing how this could machine be seen as like a window sill and a community, or a growing inequality in a sand pit. So we are like combining metaphors and trying to frame the machine and what it could be, how it could serve through those metaphorical conceptions, and trying to tease out different dimensions, like what is appearing, and then starting to relate it to some design. How could we use this machine embedded in some materiality? And so it was so similar in some aspects, or at least bits and pieces, to what we're doing.
This site is so cool. I'm looking at the machines. It's insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but the process, like, So for me, I think it's per this reflection, how different are our approaches to this thing, and we will be having like a whole semester with this, with Alma, with the researcher, and it will be actually building up this from this simple idea and project, and kind of building up on it the whole semester. So it will be very interesting, perhaps to, yeah, I'll be happy to share how, or perhaps cross-pollinate.
Interesting.
Yeah, but for me, what was like, I guess, interesting was um, that having this kind of initial, uh, yeah, and yeah, I think that would be for a longer conversation. But yeah, like finding overlaps, and yeah, yeah. And by the way, I loved also, Martin, your use of the cards and playing with the kind of organizational blocks. That was really, really cool.
You say if you have some.
Yeah, I think this is just some disjointed thoughts. Yeah, and I'm sorry for not like chipping in more, but I think it's, yeah, I just didn't see what I could bring of more relevance, so it was more, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think like in a way, like some of these structures, what Martin was pursuing. I mean, also the sort of fronts in and of themselves, having a structure like these kind of things can be pursued practically. I mean, maybe one, I would not say a mistake, because I think the session was good, but maybe not serving your needs, is that we could have, of course, just jumped into those. And maybe next time, for example, these fronts could be jumped into, because they are about practically creating what to call them, like surface front organizations in and of themselves. Because like I think there very likely are similarities with the, say, the yo-yo machines, but then for the fronts is not the only way, but certainly through that way you can start to practically engage the imaginary but also practicality of organizations in a different manner, which is, of
Yeah.
course, a huge area, huge cultural area, and
Yes.
also a cultural
Yeah.
area that is not without some projects, but is still lacking of variety in itself. So
Yes. Yes. And
there is a practical seed there, which is kind of why I was writing into how does this work and what are the rules to kind of refute the premise of that practicality. And that might be something to jump into next time, for
yeah,
example.
yeah. And it's, sorry, I didn't mean to sound that I didn't find it useful. I did. It's more like that in my way of, I guess I will be paid. So in my way of, I guess it's easy for me to get daunted when the exploration is like unconstrained, or how to say it, because I'm realizing that there is so many like rabbit holes that we could go into, and so many patterns and disciplines, and at some point for me it's a bit anxiety making, because what I'm thinking is like, oh, are we trying to construct a theory of everything by trying to understand all the discipline but not understanding none? But then I'm relating it back to, yeah, but we have this lens of organizing, so it's probably cool. Yeah, but I guess this by itself, like those reflections are useful for me. So yeah.
And
I
this
mean,
not understanding is the biggest asset that we have.
yeah, it's kind of like two-step thing. Like, uh, so on the one hand, you have to recognize that you are facing this canvas and the largeness of the canvas. That's one step. But then the second step is like with the example of fronts, and kind of connecting to the earlier conversation about the Oxel being this templator that starts to organize and therefore create structure, and how you can create it at any point. But that then precisely offers you this, like the front is now an Oxel and you can start playing it, and suddenly you have regularity. which is also what Leo was talking about. Like, so, but it's a kind of practical example of that. The only way to deal with this variety of varieties is to start to organize in this sort of floating manner, like in this point. Like, there is no reason to say that the fronts are the best concept, and it's an absurd way of even thinking about it, but it's a way, and therefore it will be evaluated by strengths and weaknesses. But it's opening up potential in this way of creating an organization super lightly, and creating functionality out of it without having to build the whole thing, which is in itself a strength. And then you can ask yourself, well, how can I use this strength? How can I use this generator to generate something that does not exist? And that's precisely, for example, one direction we could play towards next time, is to see what it generates. I think we have an idea already in terms of what we discussed, and then see how those can be used, even these ideas of websites of NPC organizations playing against each other, expanding the imagination. That's a direction, and that's something that starts to resemble your example of this, whether it was a workshop or lecture, this playing with the machines. In a way, the voxel of the front is a little machine, but then
Yeah. For what it's worth too, I always find what you say like awesome. So, you know, it's like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But okay, so I think
You're too intelligent.
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Shoot.
I think we're arriving at the end. So, but
I would like to say,
yeah, and thank you for the session, by the way. I did enjoy it. It doesn't mean I didn't. Just sharing my reflections. Yeah.
I wanted Pekko to make a proposal, if I may.
Yeah.
So I thought that it was really useful to have this kind of task to kind of also as just like a crutch to digest a bit what we did, but also to kind of start the session from something to give in a way, or to kind of share. And so I was wondering if maybe on the base of the front schematic that you have thrown in, if we should take as a kind of homework, so to speak, between the week, you know, that we just try and puzzle a few of these together. They will likely be unsimilar to some extent if you don't want to kind of, you know, throw in some like finer specifications. But I think that could be a fun thing to kind of arrive with these kind of NPCs in our pocket and like throw them at the on the desk.
Fungal desire, you know.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, totally. Like, and abuse the structure. It's not it's not like, oh, I have to make these finer points that you do it right. No. Like, if you make
that's not what I meant, but I thought there was, because I do find the idea that they might actually simulate themselves.
Yes.
Very, very fantastic.
Yeah.
But then you go into coding and really programming that. So like right now, that's just abuse. I think it's
abuse, yes. And yes, I agree with one addition, like taking from also, yeah, let's aim that we turn that into play from fairly, because it's possible already. The structure is playable, but it's certainly even more playable next week. So let's turn that into play next session. That, yes, let's do introductions of what people created, but let's set a timeline for that, so that we don't just So because
so we get a stadium announcer moment, and then they go to the same arena.
Yeah. All right.
Nice.
But
all right.
But yeah, let's first of all, with that, let's stop the recording and say goodbye to potential people, whatever ending sentences that are trying to ritualize themselves and failing. That's what you get.